Chapter 1. A Haunting Arrival. Tony Middleton adjusted his scarf as the brisk October wind swept through the narrow cobblestone streets of Cottingham. The village, tucked away in a corner of the English countryside, was a picturesque sight. Rows of ivy-covered stone cottages stood under the orange glow of lanterns, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. It was the perfect setting for the Halloween festival, which had been an annual tradition in the village for centuries. "I can't believe how beautiful it is here," Sally Cartwright said, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders as they made their way down the main road. "It's like something out of a storybook." Tony smiled at his best friend's amazement. "I told you, Aunt Agatha always says Cottingham has a charm all its own. Wait until you see the festival tonight. They really go all out for Halloween." Sally grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She had jumped at Tony's invitation to spend the weekend in Cottingham, eager to experience something different from their usual city life. As they rounded the corner, Tony's Aunt Agatha's house came into view. It was a quaint cottage, painted in warm hues, with climbing roses that twisted around the wooden doorframe. A carved pumpkin sat proudly on the front step, its flickering candle casting dancing shadows. The door swung open before they could knock, and Aunt Agatha appeared, her eyes bright and welcoming. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair that curled just below her chin and a vibrant energy. She wore a woolen shawl and a wide-brimmed hat adorned with autumn leaves, looking every bit the part of the village's Halloween traditions. "Tony, Sally, welcome, dears." Agatha's voice was filled with warmth as she ushered them inside. "You're just in time. The festival starts at dusk, and I have some special costumes ready for the two of you." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Costumes? I didn't think we were dressing up for this." "Of course you are," Agatha said with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Everyone dresses up for the masquerade. It's tradition." Sally laughed, thrilled by the idea. "I'm in. What do you have for us?" Agatha led them through the cozy sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, to a back room filled with boxes of decorations. She pulled out two elegant hand-sewn costumes. One was a dark velvet cloak with intricate silver embroidery, clearly meant for Tony, and the other was a beautiful gown in deep emerald green for Sally, complete with a matching mask. "These belong to my mother and father," Agatha said, her voice taking on a more nostalgic tone. "They wore them to the festival when they were young, and now it's your turn." Tony and Sally marveled at the craftsmanship of the costumes, and after a few minutes of fussing and fitting, they were ready for the festival. As dusk began to settle over the village, the trio left the cottage and made their way toward the village square, where the festival was already in full swing. Orange and black banners fluttered from every lamppost, and dozens of carved pumpkins lined the pathways, their faces flickering with candlelight. Stalls selling hot cider, roasted chestnuts, and sweets dotted the square, while musicians played lively folk tunes from a makeshift stage near the center. Children ran about in their costumes, laughing as they darted between the stalls, while the adults, equally dressed in elaborate attire, mingled and admired each other's masks. Tony and Sally wandered through the crowd, taking in the sights and sounds. Everywhere they looked, there was something new to catch their attention. A fortune teller reading tarot cards under a velvet canopy, a juggler performing tricks with flaming torches, and a storyteller recounting eerie village legends to a captivated audience. "I've never seen anything like this," Sally whispered in awe. "It's magical." Tony chuckled. "Just wait until midnight. That's when they light the bonfire and tell the legend of the Cottingham Manor." Sally raised an eyebrow. "What's the legend?" Tony leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "They say Cottingham Manor is haunted by the ghost of a woman named Eliza Thorne, who lived there centuries ago. She was a widow, alone and bitter after her husband died. One Halloween night, she disappeared without a trace. Some say she was murdered, others say she ran away, but the villagers believe her spirit still haunts the manor, looking for revenge. Sally's eyes widened. That's unnerving. Before Tony could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the square, followed by a piercing scream. The festival music halted abruptly, and the crowd turned as one to the source of the commotion. Sally grabbed Tony's arm, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Tony nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Stay close." They pushed through the throngs of people, following the sound of distressed voices to a narrow alleyway behind one of the stalls. A small group had gathered around someone lying on the cobblestone ground. Tony's breath caught in his throat when he saw who it was. Harold Townsend, the village's reclusive old man, lay motionless, his face pale and his eyes wide open, staring into the void. A middle-aged man in a constable's uniform was already kneeling beside Harold, checking for a pulse. Tony recognized him as Constable Albert. His face was grim as he stood up and turned to the onlookers. "He's dead," Constable Albert announced. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Some of the villagers backed away, others whispered to each other, but all eyes were on Harold's lifeless body. "What happened?" someone in the crowd asked. The constable shook his head. "I don't know yet, but this is no accident." The words hung in the air like a curse. The festive atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of fear. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, as though realizing all at once that the death had struck far too close to home. Tony looked at Sally. "Something's not right. We need to find out what really happened." Sally nodded, her heart still racing. She knew Tony's instincts were rarely wrong. As the crowd began to disperse and Albert called for the village doctor to examine the body, Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, their excitement from earlier in the evening now replaced with a grim resolve. The Halloween festival in Cottingham had taken a deadly turn, and Tony and Sally were determined to uncover the truth behind the shadows that had fallen over the village. Chapter 2. The Deadly Discovery. Tony Middleton and Sally Cartwright exchanged uneasy glances as they stood on the outskirts of the gathering. The festive glow of the Halloween lanterns now seemed cold and distant, their soft orange light casting long shadows across the cobblestone street. Tony's mind raced as he watched Constable Albert crouch next to the lifeless body of Harold Townsend, Cottingham's infamous recluse. Harold had always been a shadowy figure in the village, rarely seen, never liked. "We need to see what's going on," Sally whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the crowd. "Do you think it was murder?" Tony's gaze flickered to the body again, taking in the peculiar stillness of Harold's twisted form. His pale face was frozen in a grimace of terror, eyes wide open as if witnessing something horrific in his final moments. It didn't look natural. "I don't know," Tony said, "but whatever happened, it doesn't seem right." Constable Albert, the village's main lawman, stood up slowly, wiping his brow. His face was drawn tight, and his eyes flickered with concern. "All right, everyone," Albert announced, raising his hands to calm the rising anxiety. "There's nothing more to see here. Harold Townsend is dead, but we don't know the cause yet. Please return to the festival while we investigate. Dr. Fitzwilliam will be here soon to examine the body." The crowd hesitated, some reluctant to leave, while others shuffled nervously back toward the main square. Tony noticed that a few villagers lingered, watching Albert with sharp eyes, whispering among themselves. Tony nudged Sally gently. "Let's talk to Aunt Agatha. She knows everyone in the village. Maybe she can help us understand what's going on." Sally nodded in agreement, her eyes darting to the dark alley where Harold's body lay. "Do you think he could have been involved in something?" Tony sighed. "It's possible, but we need more information before jumping to conclusions. There's definitely something more going on here." As they turned to leave, They spotted Aunt Agatha standing by the edge of the crowd, her face drawn with worry. She was clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes locked on Harold's body as though she had seen a ghost. "Aunt Agatha?" Tony called softly as he and Sally approached her. Agatha blinked and turned to them, her normally lively expression replaced with one of deep concern. "Oh, Tony, Sally, this is awful. Poor Harold." "Poor Harold?" Sally raised an eyebrow. "From what I heard, he wasn't exactly popular around here." Agatha sighed. "That's true, dear. But no one deserves to die like this, especially not in such a terrible way." Tony frowned, curiosity tugging at him. "What do you mean? Do you know something about Harold's death?" Agatha hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. She lowered her voice and leaned closer to Tony and Sally. Harold had enemies, that much is certain. He was a bitter man, isolated, angry with the world. He fought with just about everyone in the village at one time or another. But in the last few months, something had changed. Tony exchanged a quick glance with Sally before leaning in. What changed? "He became even more reclusive," Agatha whispered. "I saw him only a few days ago, and he was a wreck. Paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. He muttered something about what's coming for him and how he couldn't escape it anymore." "I thought he was losing his mind." Sally's eyes narrowed. What could he have been afraid of? Agatha shook her head. "I don't know. But whatever it was, it clearly had him terrified. He used to be difficult, yes, but never like this. It's as if something, or someone, was haunting him." Tony was about to ask more when Constable Albert approached them, his face grim as ever. "What are you three doing here? I thought I asked everyone to leave the scene." Tony straightened up, trying to appear casual. "We were just talking to Aunt Agatha about Harold. She knows a lot about the people in the village, and we thought she might be able to help." Albert's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he sighed deeply. "We're treating this as suspicious for now. Harold didn't have the best health, but there's something about the scene that doesn't sit right. His face, it's frozen in fear. That's not a typical look for a natural death." Tony nodded. "Do you think he was murdered?" Albert crossed his arms, his gaze shifting toward Harold's body again. "It's too early to say for certain, but I won't rule it out. We'll need to wait for the doctor's report." Sally frowned. "And until then? Are there any suspects?" Albert's expression darkened. "There are always suspects when someone like Harold dies. He had more enemies than friends in this village, but I'll be looking closely at anyone who had a reason to wish him harm." Tony nodded, the gears in his mind already turning. "Do you mind if we look into this too? We've helped solve a few cases before, and we might be able to uncover something the police miss." Albert raised an eyebrow. "I appreciate the offer, but this is a police matter, Tony. You're a guest in this village, and I don't want you getting mixed up in something dangerous." Tony was about to protest, but Aunt Agatha placed a gentle hand on his arm, signaling him to let it go for now. "We'll leave it to you, Albert," she said with a small smile. "But if we happen to hear anything, we'll be sure to let you know." Albert nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Agatha. Just stay out of trouble, all of you." As the constable walked away, Tony turned to Sally, his eyes bright with determination. "We're not letting this go, are we?" Aunt Agatha chuckled softly. "I should have known you two would get involved. Just be careful, all right? Cottingham may seem quiet, but there are plenty of secrets lurking beneath the surface." Tony smiled at his aunt, but his mind was already racing ahead. There was a mystery to be solved in this village, and he and Sally were going to uncover it, no matter what. As the night wore on, Tony and Sally returned to Aunt Agatha's cottage, where they discussed everything they had learned. The village's festival continued, but the joyful spirit of the evening had vanished. The news of Harold Townsend's death spread quickly, and soon people were discussing theories, gossiping about potential suspects, and recounting Harold's bitter nature. The two young friends knew they had to start digging into the possible motives. Harold had enemies, that much was clear. But who had the most to gain from his death? And who, in this seemingly peaceful village, might be hiding a deadly secret? Chapter 3. Shadows in the Village. The morning dawned crisp and clear, but the usual tranquility of Cottingham seemed disrupted. Tony and Sally stood by the window of Aunt Agatha's cottage, looking out at the small crowd that had gathered outside the village square. "They're still talking about it," Sally murmured, crossing her arms. "It's all anyone can think about now." Tony, deep in thought, glanced at his friend. "It's not surprising. Harold may have been a recluse, but people like to talk, especially when something strange happens in a small village like this." The chatter outside hinted at growing suspicions. People were speculating about the cause of Harold's death, with some already pointing fingers at those they thought might have reason to harm him. A knock on the door pulled them from their thoughts. Aunt Agatha bustled into the room, wiping her hands on her apron as she went to answer it. When she opened the door, they were greeted by the sight of Constable Albert, looking as serious as ever. "Good morning," Albert said, his voice a little too formal. "I came by to give you an update, and to ask a favor, if you don't mind." Tony raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the constable's sudden request. "What's going on? Have you found out anything new?" Albert stepped inside, closing the door behind him and lowering his voice. "Dr. Fitzwilliam examined Harold's body early this morning. He's ruled out natural causes." Sally's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean?" Albert's eyes were grim as he answered. "Harold Townsend was poisoned." Aunt Agatha gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. "Poisoned," Tony repeated. Albert nodded, his expression grim. Fitzwilliam found traces of a rare, fast-acting poison in Harold's system. The symptoms were subtle, which is why it wasn't immediately obvious. But there's no doubt about it now. Harold was murdered. Sally took a step closer to Tony. "Poisoned at the Halloween festival? In front of everyone?" Tony frowned, thinking back to the previous night. "There were so many people there. Anyone could have done it." Albert sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's the problem. We have too many suspects and too little evidence. Most of the village was at the festival, and Harold didn't have many friends, as you know." Aunt Agatha, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Harold was difficult, yes, but who would go so far as to kill him? I can't imagine anyone in the village doing something so sinister." Albert shook his head. "It's hard to say, but we have a few people we need to question more thoroughly. That's where you two come in." He looked at Tony and Sally with a hint of reluctance. "You're outsiders, but you've got a way of seeing things that others might miss. I could use a fresh pair of eyes on this case." Tony's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You're asking us to help?" Albert gave a small nod. "I've heard about your involvement in solving a few cases back in the city. This village may be small, but it's not without its share of secrets. If anyone can help me figure this out, it's the two of you." Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. "We'd be glad to help. But where do we start?" Albert pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. "I've narrowed it down to 4 people who had the most interactions with Harold in the past few months. They're all locals, and each one had a reason to hold a grudge against him." He hesitated for a moment before rattling off the names. "First, there's Edward Granger, the village blacksmith. Harold and Edward had a long-standing feud over property boundaries. They almost came to blows more than once." Sally nodded thoughtfully. A property dispute sounds like a pretty solid motive, but would he really resort to poison? "It's hard to say," Albert admitted. "Then there's David Wilkes, who runs the general store. He seemed to sometimes talk with Edward and Harold." "The third suspect is Margaret Hollis," Albert continued. She and Harold were very close once, but rumor has it that they had a falling out and things between them have been tense. And the fourth? Sally prompted. Albert's eyes darkened. Helen Turner. She was Harold's housekeeper for many years but was abruptly dismissed under mysterious circumstances last month. She's been tight-lipped about what happened, but she hasn't exactly hidden her resentment. Tony and Sally exchanged glances, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. 4 suspects, each with a clear motive, but no obvious connection to the poison. The mystery was growing more complex with each revelation. Albert sighed and closed his notebook. I'll be questioning all of them again today, but I need you two to ask around. See what the villagers are saying. Sometimes people are more willing to talk to outsiders. If you hear anything suspicious, let me know. Tony nodded. We'll do our best. But if Harold was poisoned, it had to happen during the festival, right? Whoever did it must have been in close proximity to him. Albert agreed. That's what I'm thinking. The festival was chaotic, though. People were drinking, moving about. It would have been easy to slip something into his drink or food without anyone noticing. Sally frowned. But Harold was a loner. Was he even interacting with anyone at the festival? Albert thought for a moment. He was standing near one of the cider stalls when I last saw him. He didn't stay long, just a few minutes, but it's possible someone slipped the poison into his drink while he was there. Tony's eyes narrowed. We should start at the cider stall. Maybe someone saw something. Albert gave a curt nod. Good idea. I'll be conducting interviews at the station, but if you find anything, come straight to me. With that, the constable left the cottage. Later that morning, Tony and Sally made their way back to the village square. The cider stall, where Harold had last been seen, was still set up, though the vendor, an older man named George, looked far less jovial than he had the night before. He was cleaning up the remnants of the festival, his movements slow and deliberate. Tony approached him with a friendly smile. Morning, George. Busy night, wasn't it? George grunted in response, barely looking up from his work. Busy, sure, but not the kind of night anyone wanted. Sally stepped forward, her tone more sympathetic. We heard about Harold. You were here when it happened, right? George finally looked up, his weathered face lined with worry. I was here. Saw him standing by the stall sipping his cider. Didn't talk to him much. He wasn't the chatting sort, you know. But I saw him go pale, real sudden-like, before he stumbled off. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. Do you remember if anyone was with him? Or if anyone approached him while he was here? Tony asked. George thought for a moment, scratching his chin. Not that I can recall. People were milling about, but no one came up to him that I saw. He was by himself mostly. Sally frowned. What about his drink? Did anyone else handle it? George shook his head. Not that I saw. He poured his own cider, same as everyone else. Thanks, George. Let us know if you remember anything else, she said. As they walked away from the stall, Sally sighed. We're not getting much from the villagers. Everyone's too on edge. Tony nodded, deep in thought. We'll have to dig deeper. Someone poisoned Harold, and whoever it was had to be close enough to slip something into his drink without being noticed. Sally crossed her arms. It could be any one of the 4 suspects Albert mentioned, but which one had the opportunity? Tony glanced around the village square. We'll find out, but we'll need to talk to each of them and figure out which one had the means and the motive to commit murder. Chapter 4. Suspicions and Secrets. Tony and Sally headed back toward Aunt Agatha's cottage, intending to lay out a plan for how they would approach each suspect. However, before they could even cross the threshold, they were met by Aunt Agatha herself, bustling out with an air of urgency about her. Oh, there you are, she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed. I was just on my way to find you. It's Helen Turner, you know, the former housekeeper. She's been asking around about you two. I think she might want to talk. Tony exchanged a quick look with Sally. Helen Turner was one of the 4 suspects, and someone who could potentially hold vital information about Harold. The fact that she wanted to reach out was both intriguing and suspicious. "Where is she now?" Tony asked. Aunt Agatha pursed her lips, pointing toward the edge of the village. "She's staying with her sister, just past the church. I can take you there if you'd like." Tony and Sally nodded in agreement, and soon they were making their way through the winding village paths toward Helen's temporary lodgings. Helen Turner's sister's home was a modest cottage which appeared well kept, but there was an unmistakable air of sadness hanging over it. Helen, a stout woman in her late 50s, opened the door before Aunt Agatha even had the chance to knock. Come in," Helen muttered, her voice gravelly. Her eyes, however, darted nervously between Tony and Sally, as though she wasn't quite sure about the two young detectives standing before her. She led them into a small parlor where the furniture looked worn from years of use. She gestured for them to sit, and as they did, Aunt Agatha quietly excused herself, leaving Tony and Sally alone with the housekeeper. Helen remained standing, twisting her hands together anxiously. "You're here because of Harold's death, aren't you?" she said, without preamble. Tony leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Helen. We're trying to piece together what happened. We know Harold wasn't the most popular man in the village, but he didn't deserve to be poisoned. We understand you worked for him for quite some time." Helen's face darkened at the mention of her former employer, and she let out a short, bitter laugh. "Worked for him? I was practically a prisoner in that house." Sally's eyes narrowed with interest. "What do you mean by that?" Helen sighed deeply, pacing across the room as she spoke. "Harold Townsend was a man who thrived on control. I took care of that house for nearly 20 years, and every single day he found some new way to make my life more difficult. He was paranoid, always suspicious of everyone around him. He kept me in line with threats, insults, and once or twice, even physical intimidation." Tony frowned. "But why stay? Why work for someone who treated you like that?" Helen stopped pacing, her face hardening. "Because I didn't have much choice. Harold knew things about me, personal things. He used that knowledge to keep me under his thumb. It wasn't until last month that I finally gathered the courage to leave. But even then, he tried to destroy me." Sally tilted her head, her curiosity growing. "Destroy you? How?" Helen's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He accused me of stealing from him, said I'd taken valuable items from his home, antiques, family heirlooms. It was all lies, of course, but he made sure the whole village knew about it. Even now, some people look at me like I'm a common thief." Tony leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like a pretty solid motive to want him out of the way, Helen. Did you ever think about getting revenge?" Helen's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there, too. Fear. "Of course I thought about it. Who wouldn't? But I never would have killed him. I hated that man, but I'm not a murderer. Besides, I wasn't anywhere near him during the festival. I was at home with my sister the whole time." Sally considered her words carefully. "Did Harold have any enemies? Anyone besides you who might have wanted him dead?" Helen hesitated for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low that Tony and Sally had to lean in to hear. "Edward Granger." Tony raised an eyebrow. "The blacksmith? What's his connection to Harold?" Helen looked up, her expression grim. They had a land dispute, a nasty one. Harold had been trying to claim part of Edward's property for years, saying it was rightfully his. It nearly came to violence once. Edward threatened to kill him if he didn't stay off his land. Tony and Sally exchanged glances. Edward Granger had already been on their list of suspects, but this new information put him in a more dangerous light. Could the blacksmith have made good on his threats? Before they could ask more questions, there was a sharp knock at the door, and Helen jumped, her face paling. Who could that be?" she stammered. Tony stood up quickly. "I'll get it." He opened the door to find Constable Albert standing on the porch, his expression more severe than usual. "I need to talk to you both," he said, his voice tight. "We've had another death." The two young friends followed Constable Albert out of Helen's house and back toward the village. As they walked, the constable filled them in on the grim news. Edward Granger, the very man Helen had just mentioned, had been found dead in his workshop, poisoned, just like Harold Townsend. "Two poisonings?" Sally asked, her voice incredulous. "Who could be behind this?" Albert's jaw was set, his tone grim. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. It's too much of a coincidence that the two people with the most animosity toward each other both ended up dead within days of each other." Tony frowned, deep in thought. Is it possible someone's trying to frame one for the murder of the other? Make it look like Edward killed Harold and then died himself, possibly from a self-inflicted dose of the same poison? Albert shook his head. "It doesn't seem likely. From the position of the body and the nature of the poisoning, it looks like Edward was caught off guard, just like Harold. He didn't poison himself." Sally folded her arms, a growing sense of unease settling over her. "So, we're dealing with someone who knows how to poison without being caught, and who has a vendetta against more than one person in this village. But why kill Edward, too?" Tony's eyes narrowed. Maybe Edward knew something. Maybe the murderer got rid of him before he could talk. They reached Edward's workshop, where the door was still ajar, and a small group of villagers stood nearby, whispering amongst themselves. As they approached the scene, the weight of the mystery pressed down on them even more heavily. The list of suspects had grown shorter, but the danger was only increasing. One thing was clear. They were dealing with someone who was methodical, calculating, and capable of murder. And if they, the murderer, wasn't found soon, more lives could be at risk. Chapter 5. The Shadow over Cottingham. Inside the workshop, the air was thick with the scent of iron and smoke, mingling unpleasantly with the faint, sickly smell of poison. Edward Granger lay slumped over his workbench, his broad, calloused hands frozen in mid-motion, as if he had been interrupted while working. A mug sat nearby, its contents half drunk. It was likely that the poison had been slipped into his drink, but how, and more importantly, by whom? Sally stepped closer to the workbench, her keen eyes scanning the scene. "It looks like he didn't have time to react," she noted. "Whoever did this, they knew exactly when to strike." Tony, standing beside her, frowned deeply. "This is getting more complicated. First Harold, now Edward. Whoever is behind these murders knows how to cover their tracks." Constable Albert moved past them, carefully examining the mug. The poison was likely placed here, but Edward was a strong man. There's no way someone could have forced him to drink without him fighting back, so he must have trusted the person who handed him this. The idea hung in the air, unsettling Tony and Sally. Whoever had killed Edward was not an outsider. They were someone familiar, someone the victims wouldn't suspect. Albert straightened up and turned to Tony and Sally. "We've got to keep the villagers calm, but more importantly, we need to narrow down our suspect list. We now know for certain that Harold and Edward's deaths are connected, but the question is, how? We're dealing with someone who knew both men, someone who had access to them, and the means to poison them without raising suspicion." Sally looked at Albert. "Who else had a significant grudge against Harold or Edward? We need to talk to them again, get them to reveal more about their connections." Albert nodded. "The village isn't large. We can account for most people's whereabouts during the festival and around the time Edward was found. But I'm still suspicious of the remaining suspects. Margaret Hollis, Harold's old friend, and David Wilkes, the merchant. We should speak to them again." The first person they decided to visit was Margaret Hollis. A former friend of Harold Townsend, Margaret had once been quite close to him before a falling out that had become village gossip for months. Margaret lived on the far side of Cottingham, in a small but well-kept cottage surrounded by an overgrown garden. When Tony, Sally, and Constable Albert arrived, she was sitting outside, sipping tea with a serene expression that contrasted sharply with the rising tension in the village. "Good afternoon," Margaret greeted them, though there was an edge to her voice that suggested she wasn't pleased by their visit. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Constable Albert didn't waste any time. "I'm afraid we need to ask you a few more questions, Margaret. There's been another death." Margaret's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer as she set it down on the table. "Another death? Good heavens, who now?" "Edward Granger," Sally answered, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "He was poisoned, just like Harold." For a brief moment, Margaret's composed mask slipped. Her eyes widened in shock, but she quickly regained control. "Edward? But why?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Tony said, stepping forward. "We know there was no love lost between you and Harold, but we need to understand your connection to Edward." Margaret hesitated, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face. "I had no connection to Edward. Harold and I had our disagreements, yes, but I hardly knew Edward Granger." Sally raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "And yet, you seemed very nervous when we mentioned him." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm nervous because two people I've known for years are now dead. Do you blame me for feeling frightened?" Tony leaned in slightly. "But there's more to it, isn't there? What happened between you and Harold? What caused the rift?" For a long moment, Margaret remained silent, her gaze fixed on the untouched tea in front of her. Finally, with a deep sigh, she spoke. "Harold and we were close once. He confided in me, and I in him. But he became paranoid, secretive. He started accusing me of things, of betrayal. It was absurd, really. I tried to distance myself from him, but he wouldn't let go. He threatened to ruin me, to expose my secrets. That's when I ended the friendship for good." "What secrets?" Sally asked. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing that matters now, but Harold was a master of manipulation. He had a way of getting under people's skin, making them doubt themselves. Perhaps that's what happened with Edward, too." Constable Albert studied her for a moment longer. "Where were you during the festival, Margaret?" "In my home," she replied, her tone clipped. "I didn't attend. I've no alibi, if that's what you're getting at." Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. No alibi, a falling out with Harold, and now, 2 murders. Margaret's involvement seemed plausible, but something still didn't sit right. She didn't seem capable of such cold-blooded killings, especially not poisoning. But if not her, then who? Their next stop was David Wilkes, the local merchant, who had also been on less than friendly terms with Harold. David's shop was a busy place, filled with goods from all over the region, but when they arrived, they found him sitting behind the counter, looking unusually nervous. "David," Constable Albert began, stepping forward, "we need to talk to you about Edward Granger." David's face paled. "Edward? What about him?" "He's dead," Tony said bluntly, watching David's reaction closely. "Poisoned, just like Harold." David's hand shook as he reached for the counter, steadying himself. "Dead? But why would anyone want to kill Edward?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Sally said. "And you were one of the last people to see both Harold and Edward alive. Can you tell us where you were around the time of Edward's death?" David swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between the 3 of them. I was here, in the shop. I had customers, people who can vouch for me." Tony frowned. "You seemed very nervous when we mentioned Edward. Why is that?" David looked down, his expression tightening. Because I was afraid I'd be next." Sally's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" David hesitated, clearly torn. "Harold and Edward, they were both involved in something dangerous. I overheard them talking about it once, about money, land deals, and threats. I didn't want to get involved, but now I'm scared whoever's behind this is coming for me too." The two friends exchanged a glance. It was becoming clearer now. Harold and Edward had been embroiled in something far more complex than just personal grudges. Before they could ask David anything more, a loud commotion erupted outside the shop. The sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps filled the street, drawing their attention. Without hesitation, they rushed outside to see what had happened. A small crowd had gathered near the village square, and at the center of it was a woman, pale and trembling, clutching a letter in her hands. Tony's heart sank as he recognized the woman. It was Sarah, Edward Granger's widow. "What happened?" he asked, rushing to her side. Sarah held up the letter, her hands shaking violently. "It's a warning," she said. "They're coming for me next." Chapter 6. The Web of Secrets. Tony Middleton, Sally Cartwright, and Constable Albert stood frozen for a moment, caught in the tension of the scene. The crowd that had gathered was murmuring, exchanging anxious glances as Sarah's wails pierced the heavy autumn air. Tony was the first to recover. He stepped forward and gently took the letter from Sarah's hands. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her face was drained of color. Sally leaned over his shoulder, and Constable Albert loomed behind them, reading the ominous message. "The next will be your last warning. Leave before it's too late, or face the same fate as Edward." Constable Albert, ever the professional, took a step forward, trying to calm her down. "We'll make sure you're safe, Mrs. Granger. I'll have someone stationed outside your home." But Sarah shook her head violently, her hands gripping the folds of her dress. "No! You don't understand. Edward, he was hiding something. He never told me everything, but I knew something terrible was going on." "What do you mean? What was Edward involved in?" Albert asked. Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze darting nervously around as if she feared someone might be watching. It was something to do with Harold Townsend. They were meeting in secret for months, talking about money, land, and people they owed or had wronged. Edward tried to keep me out of it, but I overheard things. He didn't want me to know, but I could tell he was terrified. Whatever it was, it's the reason he's dead now. Tony's mind raced. There was clearly a deeper conspiracy at play, one that both Edward and Harold had been entangled in. But what was it? And who else was involved? And more importantly, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Sally touched Sarah's arm gently. "Sarah, you need to stay somewhere safe for now. If this letter is a threat, you're in danger. Do you have someone you can stay with?" Sarah nodded weakly, her resolve clearly crumbling. "I can stay at my aunt's house. Just please, find whoever did this." As Tony, Sally, and Constable Albert escorted Sarah to the safety of her aunt's home, Tony couldn't shake the sense of dread he felt. This wasn't just about two men who had crossed each other. It was about a much larger web of deceit, greed, and power. When they arrived at the modest cottage on the edge of the village, Sarah's aunt, Mrs. Porter, welcomed them with open arms. She was an elderly woman, soft-spoken and kind, with an air of quiet dignity about her. Tony and Sally explained the situation briefly, and Mrs. Porter promised to look after her niece. Once Sarah was settled, Tony turned to Sally. "We need to get to the bottom of this. There's something we're missing, something that ties all of this together." Sally nodded in agreement. "It's clear that Harold and Edward were involved in something shady, but we don't have all the pieces yet. We need to go back and speak to the others." Margaret and David both seemed to know more than they were letting on. "But who's sending the threats?" Tony asked. "It has to be someone close, someone who knows the village well enough to make their move without drawing suspicion." Constable Albert cleared his throat. "We're running out of time. If this killer strikes again, it could be tonight. We need to figure this out before anyone else dies. I have also sent a telegram to the Scotland Yard for more information that could help." Tony and Sally returned to the village square, the center of the Halloween festival. They decided to start with David Wilkes, who had seemed particularly shaken during their last conversation. His shop was dimly lit when they arrived, but David himself was inside, pacing nervously behind the counter. When he saw the two enter, he stopped, his face pale. "You're back," he said, his voice trembling. I told you everything I know." Tioni studied him for a moment, then stepped closer. "Did you? Because we just found out that Edward and Harold were involved in something together, something dangerous. We think you might know more than you're letting on." David's eyes darted to the door as if considering an escape, but there was nowhere to go. He sighed heavily and sank into the chair behind the counter. "I didn't want to be part of any of this," he admitted. "But Harold? He dragged me in." Sally raised an eyebrow. "Dragged you into what exactly?" David rubbed his face, clearly struggling with the weight of his confession. Harold was in debt, big debt. He owed money to some powerful people, and when he couldn't pay, he came up with a scheme to get the money he needed. He was going to sell off some land that didn't belong to him, land that had been disputed for years. Edward was part of the plan because he had the skills to forge the documents. "And you?" Sally prompted. I was supposed to help them find buyers," David said quietly, "but I didn't want to be part of it. I was afraid of what would happen if it all went wrong." Sally's eyes flashed with understanding. "But someone found out, didn't they? Someone who wanted revenge." David nodded, his face ashen. "I think so. I've been terrified ever since Harold died, and now with Edward gone too. I know I'm next. That letter Sarah got, I wouldn't be surprised if it was meant for me." Tony exchanged a glance with Sally. They were getting closer, but there was still one missing link, the identity of the murderer. If Harold and Edward had both been killed because of their involvement in the scheme, then who was behind it all? Who had the motive to see them dead? Before they could press David further, the door to the shop burst open, and Constable Albert rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. "There's been another death," he said, his voice breathless. "Who?" Sally asked, her heart pounding. "It's Margaret Hollis," Albert replied grimly. "She's been poisoned." The night had fallen fully by the time they arrived at Margaret's home. The small cottage was eerily quiet, with only the dim light of a lantern flickering inside. Margaret's body lay slumped over her kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine beside her. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but there was no mistaking the deadly stillness that hung in the air. "She must have been poisoned just like the others," Albert muttered as he examined the scene. Sally crouched beside Margaret's chair, her keen eyes scanning the room. But why her? She didn't seem like she was directly involved in Harold and Edward's scheme. Tony's mind raced. Maybe she knew something that made her a target. Constable Albert frowned. Or maybe she was a loose end. Whoever's doing this is cleaning up. Sally straightened up, her face set with determination. "There's only one way to find out. We need to talk to the one person who might have all the answers." Tony nodded, already knowing who she meant. "Sarah Granger." Chapter 7. The Killer. Unmasked. The flickering flames from the hearth cast dancing shadows across the room, but none of the warmth seemed to touch Sarah. She sat pale and drawn, her hands wringing in her lap. Tony could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a growing fear. Sally was the first to speak, her tone gentle. "Sarah, we need to know the truth. We understand that you're afraid, but the longer you keep quiet, the more danger there is for everyone in this village. 3 people have already died, Harold, Edward, and now Margaret. If we don't stop this, there's no telling who's next." Sarah looked down, her hands trembling. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Edward, he kept so much from me. Even before he was killed, I knew he was hiding things. The late-night meetings with Harold, the forged documents, they were getting in too deep. He was scared, but he wouldn't tell me everything. And now he's gone." "Sarah," Tony said, stepping forward. "We've learned about Harold's debts and the scheme to sell disputed land. What we don't understand is who would have the motive to kill all of them, and why Margaret Hollis, of all people?" Sarah hesitated. "Margaret," she whispered. She knew about Edward and Harold's scheme, but she wasn't involved, not directly at least. She overheard something that wasn't meant for her. Sally leaned in closer. What did she overhear? "Harold was planning to double-cross the people he owed," Sarah continued. "He thought he could sell the land, pay off his debts, and keep the rest for himself. But there was someone else, someone who wanted a piece of the deal, and Harold promised them more than he could deliver. Margaret overheard that conversation between Harold and Edward. That's why she was killed. She knew too much." Tony finally getting closer to the truth. "Who was this other person, Sarah? Who did Harold promise the money to?" Sarah shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know. Edward never told me the name, but he was terrified. He said they were dangerous, ruthless. And now, I think they're the one behind all of this." The moment they left Sarah's cottage, Tony and Sally moved with purpose. The village square was still alive with the remnants of the Halloween festival, but the festive air had become strained. Tony's mind was racing as they made their way toward the police station, where Constable Albert had been coordinating the investigation. The confusion that had shrouded the case was beginning to lift, but there was still one crucial piece missing: the identity of the person pulling the strings. As they stepped inside the station, Constable Albert greeted them with a grim nod. Sally took a deep breath. "We think we know why Margaret was killed. She overheard Harold and Edward discussing a deal gone wrong. Something about Harold double-crossing someone dangerous. Whoever that is, they're the one who's been orchestrating this." Tony shook his head. "Not quite. We need to take a closer look at who might have had something to gain from all of this. We've been focusing on Harold and Edward's involvement, but this was bigger than just them. Whoever they were working with has the real motive here." Albert's face hardened as he opened the telegram that had just been delivered by the mailman. It was from the Scotland Yard on it, and inside it simply said, "William Cartwright." Sally's head snapped up at the mention of her uncle's name. "My uncle? What are you saying?" Albert met her gaze, his expression serious. "It makes sense, Sally. The Scotland Yard had their eyes on William Cartwright for a long time. That is all I am allowed to tell you. Mr. Cartwright was close to Harold and Edward. He's been involved in the land disputes for years, trying to negotiate settlements. If Harold promised him a piece of the deal and then reneged, William would have every reason to want them both out of the way." Sally's face went pale. "But my uncle wouldn't kill. He's always been a businessman, not a murderer." Tony placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "We have to consider the possibility, Sally. He may not have done the killings himself, but he could have arranged them. He had access to poison, the means to send threatening letters, and he knew all of the victims." Constable Albert sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "William Cartwright had been avoiding any direct involvement, but he's been pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's time we confront him." The Cartwright estate was on the outskirts of Cottingham, a sprawling property surrounded by thick woods. The ride there was tense, the air heavy with unspoken fears and suspicions. Sally remained silent, her face drawn as they approached the estate. Tony knew this was hard for her, but they had to see this through. As they pulled up to the grand house, they could see light spilling from the windows. Constable Albert led the way as they knocked on the door. It took a few moments before it swung open, revealing William himself, dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, his expression one of mild surprise. "Ah, Constable. Tony, Sally," he said, his voice calm and smooth. "What brings you here at this late hour?" Albert's gaze was steely. "We need to ask you a few questions, Mr. Cartwright. It's about the deaths of Harold Townsend, Edward Granger, and Margaret Hollis." William's smile faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course. Anything to help. Please, come inside. As they stepped into the luxurious foyer, Tony couldn't help but notice the glint in William's eyes, a glint that spoke of calculation, of someone who always thought 2 steps ahead. They followed William into his study, where he poured himself a glass of whiskey before sitting down in a high-backed leather chair. Now, he said, crossing one leg over the other, what exactly are you suggesting? Sally spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. Uncle, we know about the land deal between Harold and Edward. We know that you were promised a share, and we think that when Harold couldn't deliver, you had them killed. William's expression didn't change. He swirled his glass of whiskey and took a slow sip before replying. You think I'm responsible for their deaths? That I had them killed over a land dispute? Constable Albert said in a firm tone. You had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. You've been using others to do your dirty work while you kept your hands clean. But now it's all catching up to you. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. Then slowly, William set down his glass and leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. Well, he said softly, I suppose there's no point in denying it now, is there? Sally's breath caught in her throat as her uncle's words sank in. You really did it? You're responsible for all of this? William's smile never wavered. It was business, my dear, nothing personal. Harold and Edward were liabilities, fools who thought they could outsmart me. Margaret was simply collateral damage. I couldn't let her live once she overheard that conversation. Constable Albert stepped forward. William Cartwright, you're under arrest for the murders of Harold Townsend, Edward Granger, and Margaret Hollis. As Albert cuffed William's wrists, the man's cold, calculating smile remained in place. You'll never be able to prove anything, he said quietly, but I suppose that's for the courts to decide. As William was led away, Tony placed a hand on Sally's shoulder, offering silent support. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes told him everything. The truth had been uncovered, but the cost was far greater than either of them had expected.